Hey everyone, what's going on? Thanks for tuning in to our next video in our discussion of the Cold War. Today we're going to be focusing on the man, the myth, the legend, John F. Kennedy. The objective for today is to analyze how JFK became president and what his overall domestic policy was all about. And so we're going to begin with the election of 1960. After 8 years of Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was finally time for a new president. And so the presidential election of 1960 was between two men, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. So let's go into a little bit of background on these two guys. Both men grew up very different but had very similar goals for the country. John F. Kennedy was from a wealthy and powerful Massachusetts family. He had 3 brothers and a father who made a lot of money bootlegging during Prohibition. John F. Kennedy went to Harvard. He served in World War II and was actually a war hero because his ship, the PT-109, actually sank and he was stranded for a while and then injured. And so he's considered a war hero. He was also the author of a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. And he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1953 as a Democrat. He was also a Catholic, which was important because many people were biased at this time against Catholics, thinking that if Kennedy became president, he would somehow be under the control of the Pope. Yeah, people can be crazy, especially in the 60s. Now, Richard Nixon is going to have almost the complete opposite upbringing to John F. Kennedy. He is going to grow up poor and have to work for much of his young adult life. He actually had to give up a full ride to Harvard to stay at home to take care of his family. He had a sick brother and his parents had a store, and so he had to work there. So he goes to Whittier College in California, and then he goes to Duke University after to become a lawyer. And he then goes on to serve in the Navy. He becomes a senator from California. He is, of course, the Republican candidate, so he was a Republican then. And then he serves as vice president to Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the election is not so much decided based on politics, but it's really decided on looks. The 1960s was the kind of era of the television, and the two candidates are going to take part in the first ever presidential debates that were on live TV. And the debates were pretty interesting because what the results were was that Kennedy is going to look sort of calm, cool, collected. He had a suntan because he had been campaigning out in California, whereas Nixon is going to look really nervous, sweaty, unprepared. The famous story is that Nixon refused makeup and Kennedy put makeup on. And as Americans watch this, they're going to decide that Kennedy is likely going to be the better fit. And some of you might be saying, well, how much can a TV debate really impact an election? And it actually turns out a lot, because John F. Kennedy and his vice president, who is Lyndon B. Johnson, and that's an important person to note, they are going to win this election by only 113,000 votes. That is the closest election result in U.S. history. So it actually turns out to make a big difference, and many historians think that the TV debates actually win it for Kennedy. So Kennedy and Johnson are going to now be in the White House, and Kennedy is going to take the oath of office and give one of the most famous inaugural addresses in U.S. history, where he is going to say the famous words that you probably heard before.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
And so what I want you to do right now is pause the video and actually read Kennedy's inaugural address and answer a few questions based on this. So it should be no surprise to you that the Kennedys, both John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie, were both extremely stylish people, and they really had a sort of glamour Hollywood feel about themselves. And so it reminds many of sort of a modern day Camelot. And Camelot was the mythical court of King Arthur. But really what's important here is the way that the Kennedys looked and the sort of aura about both of them and the youthfulness about both of them. Pictures such as this really demonstrate the Camelot nature of Kennedy's presidency, because it really shows the perfect family. You see Kennedy and his wife and their two kids, John here, and Caroline. They sort of represented the stereotypical perfect family. Besides his family, Kennedy also surrounds himself with some of the best and brightest minds. For example, he is going to hire Dean Rusk to be his Secretary of State, who was a well-known businessman. Robert McNamara, who had been the head of Ford Motors, is going to be the Secretary of Defense, and very importantly, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, or RFK, is going to be hired as the Attorney General. All three individuals are going to be very important in solving some of the crises of Kennedy's presidency. So like previous presidents, Kennedy comes in as a man with a plan. And so like TR's Square Deal and FDR's New Deal, JFK comes in with the New Frontier, and this is the name of his domestic and foreign policy agenda, which involves changing education, civil rights, healthcare, and jumpstarting the space program, in addition to fighting communism abroad. So out of the New Frontier, JFK creates his first program in September of 1961 called the Peace Corps, and this was designed to help fight poverty around the world, and it involved sending young American volunteers to perform humanitarian services. And it's a really cool program because it's still around today, and it's really one of JFK's most important legacies. Winning the space race. So besides the arms race, the United States was also in a race to be the first country to get a man on the moon. And this was Kennedy's main goal. He was really committed to putting a man on the moon, and although he would die before this happens, the United States does end up beating the Soviet Union in the space race, and they achieved this in 1969. In addition, the New Frontier attempted to help with the civil rights movement. If you remember, Kennedy helped with organizing the March on Washington. Kennedy was a big supporter of Martin Luther King. He actually attempted to get a piece of legislation passed that would achieve a lot of King's goals, but sadly he is going to die before this happens, and his vice president, who will become president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is going to be the one who addresses this. And then lastly, the New Frontier attempted to address women's rights. At this time, there were many studies that showed that women who were working the same job as men received a lot less money. This is called a pay gap. And so in 1963, John F. Kennedy is going to attempt to address this pay gap by creating the Equal Pay Act, which basically forced companies who were involved in commerce to pay women and men, if they were involved in the same job, the same amount of money. And that must seem like common sense, but at the time, and even today, there is a big difference between the amount of money that women make and the amount of money men make when they are doing the same job. Alright everyone, thanks for watching today's video on John F. Kennedy and his presidency.